said it before, and I'm going to say it again. Vampire flicks are back, baby. What is up, everybody, and welcome to my early review of Robert Eggers' Nosferatu. This is one of my most anticipated films of the year, certainly my most anticipated film for December, and I was fortunate enough to be given a screener so that I could check this out a few weeks early. It is going to be released wide on Christmas Day, so be sure to check it out in theaters right after you open those presents if you're a vampire fan like I am. Show up, represent it. And of course, with that being said, I'm going to do my best to keep this review absolutely spoiler-free, not get into any kind of specificity that could alter your experience so that you guys can walk in as fresh as possible on the 25th. Now, this is a movie that I've been very curious about for a number of reasons. Number one, Robert Eggers is one of these modern filmmakers that has been getting a lot of praise, a lot of accolade that I certainly am interested in. I think that the way that he makes films, his style, his period piece approach is very interesting. It's very unique. It's a very much needed voice in modern filmmaking. His movies overall don't always work for me. I did not like The Lighthouse. The Witch is a movie that I certainly appreciated, but don't see myself ever really rewatching. And The Northman of the three before this actually was my favorite. I enjoyed that film quite a bit. And so I really didn't know what to expect from his take of Nosferatu. Is this going to lean much more into the weirdness of The Lighthouse? Is this going to lean heavily into that period piece dialect that he went for in The Witch? Or is this going to be something a little bit more mainstream, a little bit more accessible, a little bit more broad appeal like The Northman? And then beyond my curiosity with Eggers, I was just very interested to see what a modern version of Nosferatu was going to look like. For those that don't know, the original 20s film, the silent German film, is actually an adaptation of Bram Stoker's Dracula. Nosferatu is Dracula, just with a few tweaks, a few changes, a few name changes, motivation changes, things like that. But at its heart, it's Bram Stoker's Dracula. So seeing a modern version of that story, taking the Count Orlok variation, which at least through the 90s was one of the more iconic looks of a vampire, of a Dracula variant. I mean, look at the Nickelodeon back in the day when I was a kid. You had like Are You Afraid of the Dark bits in SpongeBob. You could even look at something like Stephen King's Salem's Lot, whether you're looking at the 70s miniseries or this most recent movie adaptation, and the lead vampire villain in both of them is very heavily inspired by Nosferatu. So always loved the Max Schreck look of that character and always wanted to see somebody take a modern stab at it. So, as a self-professed vampire fanatic, is this something that I highly enjoyed? Is this the masterpiece that so many people want it to be and some are already hailing it to be? Or is this another one of those films that I would say that I respect more than I actually enjoyed it? Starting off with the positives, the best thing about this movie, the thing that I love it for, the thing that I will remember it for, is that this is visually immaculate. From the production design, to the set design, to the costume design, to the use of natural lighting and the choices in the color palette. Visually, this thing is like a canvas, almost every single frame of the film. There are so many sequences that have like this very euphoric, dreamlike quality to it that's literally mesmerizing to look at. And I don't use that word lightly. This is something that from a visual standpoint, from a technical standpoint, is a masterpiece. I think it's easily the most ambitious thing that Eggers has done yet from a production standpoint. I think he nails the period piece aesthetic of everything, from the costumes to the sets. When you have things like the Orlok Castle in the background, it has this very gothic, haunting look to it. And especially the lighting and the color palette, which I love because it really gives you this modern gothic aesthetic while also having kind of that old school black and white flavor in there. This is not a black and white film, but so much of the movie is painted in these grays and these very off shades of blue, where it gives you that vibe of that old school monster movie. And this is one of my favorite utilizations of shadows in a movie ever. You've seen a few of these shots in the trailer, like the one where you have the shadow of Orlok's hand painting over the city that he's about to take over. That might be my favorite shot in a film in 2024. It's just so simple, yet so effective, so awesome. And there's so many sequences throughout the movie where you get the shadow of Count Orlok as kind of your main sense of this impending doom. You get the shadow of his demonic looking fingers. You get the silhouette of his very humanoid looking face. And just that brings most of the sense of unease in this movie than anything that's a lot more deliberately horror that is going on. And I also just loved how it's a very classic approach to vampirism. This is something that dates all the way back to movies like the original Nosferatu or the black and white Universal films, the original Dracula, the Bela Lugosi stuff, where it's so old school vampire with shadows and having hands come up and open doors through shadows, or having like very simple suggestions onto human characters, almost like the Jedi mind trick. I love that old school stuff, and I love how Eggers modernized it to his own effect here in Nosferatu. All across the board, the movie's got incredible performances. You're going to hear a lot of people say that Lily Rose Depp deserves to at least get an Academy Award nomination, if not the win for Best Actress, and that is absolutely earned. I've not really seen a whole lot from her. I think I've seen her in like Tusk, maybe a few other things. I know she's Johnny Depp's daughter, but this is the first real introduction that I have had to her, and she has a lot on her shoulders in this movie. She's the person that the entire crux of the theme of this movie is on. Her performance is literally the linchpin of this film working or not working, and she does an incredible job. In so many sequences, she has to do a lot of different things at once. She has to come across as frightened, as haunted, as kind of turned on and horny to a certain degree, while also being very aggressive and having this possessed vibe to her where she's almost got a little bit of the vibe of Nosferatu himself, because he's kind of inside of her soul to a certain degree. And just physically, it's an incredibly demanding role. There's a lot of convulsing. There's a lot of like going into a trance and contorting your body into these weird positions for just a really grotesque look, if nothing else. And so if she does get a nomination, she absolutely deserves it. I think for the win, she's battling it out hard with Mikey Madison, if I was the person to nominate everybody. But yeah, she does a fantastic job. She is absolutely the star of the show here. Nicholas Hoult is fantastic, as he always is. I really love that guy here. He's playing kind of the more straight man. He's the husband of Lily Rose Depp's character, and so he's the one who is quite literally facing off with Nosferatu throughout most of the film, both mentally and physically. And then, of course, you have Bill Skarsgård as Count Orlok himself. And just like Colin Farrell's performance as the Penguin, this is one of those transformations of an actor where if you did not tell me this was Bill Skarsgård, that is probably the last person that I would guess is playing Count Orlok. Like physically, underneath the makeup, underneath the design of Count Orlok, he disappears, but his voice, his dialect, the vibrato and the bass that comes with his voice, which I'm sure they probably helped to modulate it a little bit, he just disappears. Like you don't see Bill Skarsgård at all. All of us know what he looks like when he tries to transform into characters like Pennywise. You could still kind of see him in there. So I kept picturing what his version of Nosferatu was going to look like, because they never really showed him in the trailers. And when they eventually do show him, I couldn't really believe that it was him. Like, it was absolutely amazing that they were able to hide him, and he was able to hide himself within his performance that well. But it's a very interesting character. It's a very unique take on a vampire or a version of Dracula, where he's very poetic with the way that he talks. He has moments where he has to get very intense and very angry, and that's where you really get the intensity of his performance. You have certain segments where he's really kind of diving into the love, lust relationship going on with Lily Rose Depp, which is very convincing. He's another actor in this movie that I would not be surprised if he at least gets a nomination for Best Supporting Actor. The makeup effects, the people that did that, if nothing else, should get a nomination. But yeah, for a movie that's definitely going to be in heavy awards consideration, Lily Rose Depp and Bill Skarsgård. Don't be surprised if you see them on the ticket this year. And the last nod that I'll give, even though the entire cast is great, is that Willem Dafoe is awesome in here. He's kind of playing a bit of a variation of a Van Helsing character, much more of a professor style of the Van Helsing character, where he's very knowledgeable of the supernatural, of the occult. He kind of comes across as a little nutty and crazy because he believes in all this crazy shit, and it's not until the third act where, Nosferatu's menace is in full effect, that everybody starts to buy into what Willem Dafoe is preaching. But I thought that he was incredible. Like, he just works really well underneath Eggers. For as much as I don't like The Lighthouse, I think that just the way that Eggers writes dialogue, the way that you have this old school dialect, I think Willem Dafoe as a performer matches up very well with that. And so he's great here as well. Now, I have to be honest, I actually watched this film twice before I felt comfortable enough to review it. And I'm very glad that I did that. Sometimes you have a movie where, unfortunately, as a reviewer, you have this expectation to go see something once, have your thoughts in concrete, and then put the video out or write the review as soon as possible because people are anxious for your thoughts. And most times that works out fine. Sometimes, though, there's a film that it really deserves to have you kind of sit on your thoughts a bit, maybe even revisit it a second time like I did this. Get a little bit more of a clear understanding of what your experience with all of this is. Nosferatu is not a complicated plot. It's a very straightforward, simplistic narrative, but everything else in this movie is just so potently artistic that there's a lot to take in. And so when I first watched this film, I actually messaged a few of my friends and I was like, hey, yeah, I checked out Nosferatu. Like, I liked it. I'm not going nuts about it like I think everybody else is going to, but I dig it. And then I watched it a second time, and a lot of the things that I was kind of on the fence about, that I wasn't crazy about, that didn't really land for me, landed much better. And one of the reasons why, which I'll get into a little bit later, is I watched it with subtitles on, because this does go for that old school dialect. So I was able to understand a little bit more narratively when I watched it a second time. But the main thing that worked much better for me on rewatch is that this has a very unique approach to the whole love-lust relationship between your vampire character and your lead actress. The Dracula's eternal love theme is nothing new, but Nosferatu's take on it is a lot more tragic. There's a lot more of this darkness to it. There's like this sick obsession in there that leans much more into lust and like this tying of souls than your traditional gothic love story. And the way that this movie approaches that between Count Orlok and Lily Rose Depp's character of Ellen is really the entire point of the movie. That's the main relationship. That's the main narrative drive going on. And the way that they decide to wrap that up, again, no spoilers. At first, I felt like it was a very anticlimactic ending. It was like, this is kind of a quiet way to go out that isn't necessarily as satisfying for more of a genre vampire flick fan like myself. On second watch, the way that they decided to end it, I felt was the perfect ending to this movie. It was the perfect ending to that story, to that whole thematic element that's driving the film. And the visual that it leaves off on is kind of all of that wrapped up in just a still image. Again, can't get into specificity. Maybe I'll do a spoiler review. I'll go check this out in theaters. But I really enjoyed that unique take that this has between the vampire character and his eternal love/lust for the female character and how that plays out throughout the movie. Now moving on to the mixed, and I have a lot to discuss here in the mixed column, and it's important to say that pretty much all of this, in fact, no, all of it is leaning very heavily into mixed positive. And I think the more that I sit on this movie, if I go to the theater and check it out a third time, I'm very confident that some, if not all of these, will slip into the positive column. But these are all the things that even after 2 watches, I still wasn't 100% sold on. And the main thing to talk about here is that while I will go on record and say that this is my favorite version of the classic Bram Stoker's Dracula story, we have gotten so many versions of that classic story that there is a bit of familiarity to this narrative. There's a bit of predictability to it. You can kind of see where things are going. You can see what characters are supposed to represent the classic characters, like Willem Dafoe's version of what I saw as Van Helsing, things like that. So I think that will hold it back for some people, and it did hold it back for me much more on the first watch than it did the second watch. This is something that we have seen so many times in so many different ways that even a brilliant version of it is going to have some form of familiarity to it that's probably going to lead to disappointment for some. It's like a Christmas Carol. How many different versions of that have we seen? We know where things are going. We know where the story's going to end. So I do think that this is the version of Bram Stoker's Dracula that I will choose to go back to, that I will experience the most, and there's not many versions of that story that I go back to and revisit. But if you're looking for a modern take that is going to go in all these wild new directions, I don't think that's what the aim of this movie was. Second thing that I'm very torn on is the design of Count Orlok himself. Now, the Max Schreck version of this character, as I was saying earlier, is one of the most iconic and, in my opinion, one of the scariest designs of vampires, of Dracula in movie history, and all the different iterations that have kind of taken their own version of the Max Schreck Nosferatu. They do a very different take on the character visually here. And I'm not going to get specific, but while there's certain things that I really like, where vampires, of course, are the undead, and they lean into that a bit here, where he's kind of a bit of a rotting corpse to a certain degree, that I thought was very cool. The size, the imposing nature of Bill Skarsgård's Orlok is very creepy. It is very iconic in the way that he looks, I think. But there's a couple of choices that just kind of take away from the creep factor for me. And I don't want to say specifically what it is. When you see the movie, you'll know. I don't know if it was just something they threw in there to be different. I don't know if that's just Robert Eggers' very off sense of humor kind of at play here. There's something physically going on with Nosferatu that is going to work for some and not work for others. And the final mixed aspect is that Robert Eggers' signature old school dialect. Now, this is not as heavy or as thick as a movie like The Witch, but it's certainly heading down that same street. He is very particular about his period piece detail. I think that's one of his biggest strengths as a filmmaker. So it's certainly something that I knew I was going to have to deal with here, and I think it's going to work for most people while turning off a few. As I said earlier, I watched this a second time with subtitles on. That helped me tremendously, being able to pick up some of the dialogue. There's some very thick accents. They're using very old English dialect, old phrases that I've never heard in my life. Like, nobody in this movie says sunrise. They say the first crow of cock, which thank you, Nosferatu, because that's something I'm absolutely going to just incorporate into my everyday life. Like, hey, see you on the first crow of cock. Top of the cock to you, sir. Oh, I've got so much editing to do. I'm going to be in here working until the first crow of cock. There's a lot of that stuff here where very easily you can kind of just miss the context of what is going on in the conversation without a second watch or without a lot of knowledge of how people used to talk. I think that it's important for Eggers' style, but it also is a bit of a barrier, I think, to understanding what's going on with the characters, what's going on fully with the narrative for some people. And now moving on to the negatives, and I have two things to say here. They're fairly small in the grand scheme of things. The first one, which I think is going to be very subjective, I don't find this movie to be scary whatsoever. Now, it takes a lot for me to say a movie's scary, but even though I'm not actually physically scared, I can still acknowledge a lot of horror films that I see are very tense, very creepy, very unnerving, and I just didn't really get any of that here. To me, this is much more focused on kind of the gothic fantasy nature of things than the horror itself. There is horror, there is blood, there is a bit of gore in here. They're definitely going for some creepy images, and some are creepier than others, but if you're walking into this with any expectation of it being one of the scariest films of the year, the vast majority of you will not see this movie as that. And the final negative that I have, which is the only thing narratively that I did not fully grasp even with a second watch, is the inciting incident that ties Lily Rose Depp's character to Count Orlok. The movie literally opens with this scene with her essentially calling out for a companion. She's so lonely, she's so stricken with this isolation that she wants somebody or something, and that awakens Count Orlok. You know, same as the classic film, same as the original story, so that's not really a spoiler. But I wish they would have dove a little bit more into why, like what caused her to do that, what was going on in her life that made her do that. After two watches, I never really grasped why, and what about her specifically linked psychically to Count Orlok. That's the one thing in the story that I'm still very fuzzy on. Now, the only other thing that I really can't hold against this film but is worth stating, I'm much more of a genre vampire flick guy than a cinephile vampire flick guy. I am somebody who's going to pick up The Lost Boys, Fright Night, even something like Abigail. That's been my #1 movie of the year for most of this year, numerous times before I'll revisit something like this. But with that being said, as a movie that isn't typically my type of thing, isn't typically the type of film that I would gravitate towards, this is easily one of the best versions of this that I've ever seen. And with that being said, guys, overall, I really enjoyed this movie. It's definitely one of the best films of the year. You're going to see a lot of people coming out of it saying it is the best film of the year. I'll be shocked if we don't see some awards given to this one. It's one of those rare movies that is one of those films that I typically would watch once and not really go back to, that I'm so intoxicated with the visuals, if nothing else, and with the artistry going on and how they crafted this thing, that I actually want to do the work. I want to revisit it. I want to see it in theaters with a crowd. I want to have discussions with people. And as a massive vampire flick fan who's been wanting a resurgence of this subgenre for years, the fact that we're getting so many and now we're getting movies of this caliber, we're eating good. We're eating very good. Well, that's it for this one, guys. If you enjoyed that, please click over here for all of my 2024 new release reviews. I'm also going to put my top 10 vampire movies up here for you to check out. Please like, share, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss everything in the future. I'll probably do a Robert Eggers ranking when this movie officially releases towards the end of December. And as always, remember, opinions are like assholes, but that doesn't mean you have to be.